Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and I'm here in the storage warehouse of the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada in Winnipeg, having a look at an AIR-2 Genie air-to-air rocket, also known as the Dum-Dum, the Ding-Dong, and the High Card. Now, this was developed by Douglas Aircraft starting in 1954, and despite its variety of colorful code names, was a rather extreme and rather terrifying solution to a very real problem faced by defense planners in the early 1950s. So until the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles in the late 1950s, the only means by which the Soviet Union had to attack the mainland United States was manned bombers, such as the Tupolev Tu-4, which was their copy of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the Tupolev 95 Bear, large turboprop-powered bomber, and the Tupolev 16 Badger jet-powered bomber. And so North American aerospace defense consisted of a series of manned interceptors that were designed to shoot down Soviet bombers coming over the polar route. The problem was, this early in the 50s, guided missile technology was really in its infancy, and so all that these interceptors could field was a World War II loadout of machine guns, cannons, and unguided rockets. And while this was perfectly effective during the Second World War, during the Cold War, this was woefully inadequate. In the Second World War, if you let a couple of bombers go through, well, then you would lose at most a couple of city blocks. In the nuclear era, if you let a couple of bombers get through, well, then you would lose a couple of cities. So the aerospace industry started scrambling, looking for an interim solution that would allow them to shoot down as many Russian bombers in as little time as possible. And Douglas Aircraft came to the rather horrific conclusion that the best way to shoot down a nuclear bomber was with a nuclear weapon. So the Genie was actually armed with a W-25 warhead with a yield of 1.5 kilotons. This is about 1/10 of the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And the idea was that an interceptor aircraft would fire this at a Soviet bomber stream, and the immense blast radius of around 300 meters, as well as the intense radiation flux, would either destroy a large number of Russian bombers outright, or it would kill their crews with radiation, and they would eventually crash. And because this interception was supposed to take place at altitudes of 15,000 feet or higher, this was deemed safe to use over populated areas. So if that's not terrifying enough, what's truly horrifying is just how crude this weapon is. There's really nothing to this. There's no guidance system or sophisticated fusing mechanism to speak of. This is just a nuclear warhead, a Lt.Col SR-49 solid rocket motor, a couple of fold-out fins, and a very simple time fuse. So the aiming and firing of the rocket would be coordinated by the interceptor aircraft's fire control system, and when it was fired, the motor would fire for about 2 seconds, accelerating the rocket to Mach 3.3, and then it would start the timer. And the timer would set off the warhead around 10 seconds and 10 kilometers later. And that long range, along with the launching aircraft taking violent evasive action, would theoretically have saved the crew from the effects of the blast. So the W-25 warhead was first tested on June 16, 1956 as the Osage shot of Operation Red Wing, whereas the Genie itself was only live test fired once on July 19, 1957 as the John shot of Operation Plum Bob. And it was fired at an altitude of around 20,000 feet over Yucca Flats on the Nevada test site from a Northrop F-89J Scorpion interceptor aircraft piloted by Captain Eric Hutchinson and Alfred Barbie. And in order to demonstrate that this would be safe to use over populated areas, a group of 5 Air Force personnel plus a cameraman actually volunteered to stand below ground zero in their shirt sleeves in ordinary military uniforms. And there's quite amazing footage of this where you can see there's a giant flash and a shockwave that reaches the ground sometime later. But because the detonation occurred at such a high altitude, their radiation exposure was minimal, and most of the fallout from the actual detonation was carried away by high altitude winds. So the Genie entered service with the US Air Force in 1957, and it was carried by 3 primary interceptors: the F-89 Scorpion, as I already mentioned, the F-101 Voodoo, and the F-106 Delta Dart. Well, and there were plans to fit it to the F-104 Starfighter and the F-102 Delta Dagger, but these fell through for one reason or another. Less well known, though, is that the Genie was actually fielded by the Royal Canadian Air Force starting in 1965, and it was one of two nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft weapons deployed by the RCAF, the other being the Boeing CIM-10 Beaumark surface-to-air missile. Now, we don't typically think of Canada as being a nuclear-armed nation, and really, technically, we weren't, because we didn't actually own these weapons. They were still in U.S. custody, and through a key-sharing agreement, they were kept stored on Canadian air bases under American Guard, and if Russian bombers were ever detected coming over the pole, they would be passed over to Canadian custody and mounted on Canadian aircraft for use. And this really made sense from a strategic point of view, because due to the short range of American interceptor aircraft, and especially the Beaumark missile, any counterattack launched from U.S. soil, the interception would actually take place over Canadian cities. So it was in the Canadian government's best interest to adopt these weapons and push that interception range much farther north into less inhabited areas of North America. Now, in total, around 3,000 Genies were produced, the production ending in 1962. And despite them being very quickly replaced by more sophisticated guided missiles, they actually remained in official service for a very long time, not being retired from the RCAF until 1983 and the US Air Force in 1988. Now, that's the overall history, the sort of big picture view of the Genie. But what about the details? How were these actually used in combat? What tactics would they have used to make sure that they weren't shooting down fellow interceptors, to make sure that they were saturating the target and destroying as many bombers as possible? What were the actual logistics of using this weapon? Well, thankfully, I have somebody with first-hand experience of that who can answer all of those questions for us. So I'm joined today by Lieutenant Colonel retired Darrell Marleau, and you were actually a navigator on the Voodoo, correct?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was the guy in the back, or what we called ourselves the GIB, or the Weapons Systems Officer.
Okay, and you were actually trained to use the Genie.
Yep, that was my job, essentially, to navigate or to coordinate the aircraft onto the target and then hand the firing over to the pilot.
Okay, so why don't you tell us a little bit about your career in the RCAF, and then we'll go into more detail about the Genie itself.
Sure. I joined the Air Force in December 77, went through basic training for 3 months in the first 3 months of 78. And then after that, I went through the navigation school and was lucky enough to be selected to go fly Voodoos in Bagotville, and started there in April of 1979. And then it was a 6-month training course, and then I went to 425 Squadron, where I spent 3 years on the squadron. And then after my Bagotville experience, I went off to Chatham, New Brunswick for another 2.5 years of flying the Voodoo, where I finally got my 1,000th hour.
Nice. All right, so one thing I've always wondered about with regards to the Genie is, like, what were the tactics used? Because I can imagine, trying to coordinate a bunch of interceptors together to shoot down a squadron of Soviet bombers, rather difficult on the best of days with a regular, munition. But with something that has a 1.5 kiloton warhead on it, I imagine that would be kind of tricky. So how did you go about it? What did an intercept profile look like?
Well, it was completely dependent upon the target regime.
Okay.
And that was, we always got our initial heads up from NORAD headquarters, or North Bay is where they controlled the aircraft out of. And then they had regional transmission sites. And so essentially you'd get a heads up that something's coming from North Bay. And then what we'd do is we'd prep, and then we get scrambled and we would take off. If it was a low-level aircraft, because sometimes the Russians were just starting their low-level penetration rolls with some of the higher-speed bombers, then we would just do a flat burner out to the location and do a low-level intercept, sometimes head-on, sometimes in the what we call a hook ID.
Okay.
Or medium and higher altitudes, it was a little bit easier because you could actually get much further lock on the radar. And then once you got
there's
radar
backscatter,
yeah, because NORAD would control you right up until the time that you said, Roger, contact, I have control.
Okay, so it put you on an intercept vector,
Yep.
and you would follow that until you had a contact on your radar screen,
Exactly.
and then you would take over.
Exactly.
Okay, and so I'm like just wondering about the specifics for this. Like, was this any different from, say, using a conventional guided missile?
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Because the Genie was a semi-active radar-guided missile or rocket, actually. So there was no internal guidance. All commands were generated out of the cockpit through actually that hose right there. That's the firing location, and that is the information to the warhead that set essentially a timer.
Okay.
That the warhead would explode upon.
It was around a 10-second timer, correct?
Well, it depended upon the contact, your closure speed, your altitude,
so it was variable. Okay.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Neat. And did you carry out like the training exercises for this? Like,
we did all
sorts,
because it was a nuclear weapon, which we could neither confirm nor deny. One of the things that was always required is in Canada. Canada never ever owned these.
No,
they were actually owned by the Yanks and controlled by the Yanks until we were transferred two-man control after the aircraft was loaded and we were on 5-minute alert or 15-minute alert or half-hour alert, depending upon the situation.
And about how long would that process take from alert to it being transferred over into Canadian custody?
It could happen very rapidly in an emergency situation. But generally speaking, we practiced that in what we call a mass load, where you'd have a whole line of airplanes and then the weapons would be transferred from the Americans to the Canadians to do the upload, and then to the air crew once that upload was finished.
Okay, so you're saying two-man control, so like safety interlock.
Yes.
So that would have been which two? So that would have been
the pilot and the navigator.
Yourself. So you had both. You had the keys, as it were.
What essentially is that the navigator carried the little plastic cartridges that you actually broke open.
Oh, okay.
And then pulled out, and then you would get a code.
Yeah.
And then you would have to confirm that code with the launch agency, which would be NORAD, to say, yes, I have this code, confirm, authorized to attack, etc., etc. We had a pattern for that we practiced over and over, which I can't remember right now, but it has been a little while.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. And then, so you would confirm that code, and then would there be an actual like arming box in the aircraft? You would punch in the code and it would arm the warhead?
Well, there was we didn't need the code to arm the airplane because it was just strictly a verbal interchange.
Okay.
And then once we got that confirmation back from the NORAD controller, then I would push in the arming circuit breakers for it. And then once that happened, then it was up to us, the pilot and the navigator, to decide, or the WISO to decide on the parameters of shooting the weapon.
Okay. And so, as I was saying before, in terms of coordinating between multiple interceptors, so how many aircraft would scramble at one time? Like, I guess it would depend on the situation, the number of aircraft. But was there like a rule of 2 aircraft per enemy aircraft or something like that?
Normally, we flew in pairs, and we flew battle pairs, which is a loose formation. This is what drives me crazy when I see these things on TV. You have all these aircraft flying into combat in tight formation, which is strictly for show and never used in reality.
It's great for an air show, but it's going to get you in trouble in combat.
Exactly, because one shot can kill 2 airplanes then.
Yes, exactly. And that was like when they were filming Top Gun, they were doing the original, like how it was actually, and they're like, well, this is boring. The aircraft are almost beyond visual range, so no, let's tighten it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it doesn't look nearly as cool in real life. Yeah. So, do you have any interesting stories
Oh,
from
I got
your
several.
career? Oh, okay. Let's hear them. Let's do
Well,
this.
first of all, let me first describe what it was like to fire it, because I got to fire it once at Combat Pike off the coast of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, an inert version, I would say.
We called it the Blue Blivet.
Okay. I've also heard it referred to as the Dum Dum.
We never referred to it. We always called it the Blivet.
Okay. Okay.
That was the Canadianization of the American Dum Dum.
Yeah.
So
because it was for them, it was Ding Dong Dum Dum Hike. They had a whole bunch of silly names for it, which is
we just called it the Blivet.
yeah.
But yeah, probably we went down there, and it's a very, very controlled process. And you practice the loading to give the crews, the ground crews and the load crews, the training. You practice the intercept, and at the time they were using old F4s as targets.
Yeah, the drones.
Yes.
Correct? Yeah.
Yes. And anyway, so that was it was a good solid target that you could use on the radar, and it was always at a high altitude. But the other thing that was very interesting is that when you were, once you took off, you had to go through some very, very strict firing procedures. And what they did is on this thing, they gave it maximum flight time. And so as to allow the Blivet just to get as far away as possible. And then it carried an 800-pound cement head with a what do you call it, a self-destruct mechanism. So at 10.5 seconds out, it would just blow up, and all the pieces would scatter.
Yeah, it would just like destroy the airframe.
Exactly. So the first time I fired it, or the only time we fired it, is we were doing a 28,000 feet roughly, and 550 knots. We locked onto the target, straight level, pulled the trigger, and you get the X and the 8-ball. As soon as you get the X, the doors rotate and the whole airplane starts to vibrate. And then when it ignites, when the engine, because what happens is there's a plunger here and a plunger here that punches the aircraft, punches this
rocket down.
Yeah, and then right here is the cable, which is your arming cable. And as soon as that gets pulled, the engine ignites. Well, it is like a freight train coming off the rails. The whole airplane just shakes like crazy. And then the breakout maneuver was you rolled 120 degrees and you pulled this maximum G down. And then that would give you the maximum escape from the blast. We cheated a little because we wanted to see what it looked like. But by the time we got out of the big smoke from the engine, this thing was just a contrail that you could not even see the end of. That's how fast that guy accelerated.
Well, it went from whatever your airspeed would be to Mach 3.3, I believe, in like 10 seconds. Or in 2
it's 3.3 over and above the speed of the aircraft.
Yes. Yeah, over 2 seconds.
In 2.2 seconds,
That's blistering.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it required that because it needed to go through 20 G to arm the
actual warhead,
the warhead. So that's why it accelerated so fast. And they said, so if you ever had an accidental drop of these things, it would never fire. Or nor could it explode because it would never arm, because it has to go through an arming sequence of 20 G.
Okay.
Or better than that, actually.
Okay, yeah. I was wondering about like what safety devices it had, because it was produced, I think, too early to take advantage of a lot of the safety devices that were developed for American nuclear weapons.
Yep, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah. So what other experiences?
Well, one of the most interesting stories that I heard, I never saw it, but I heard of it, was a pilot by the name of Jean-Michel Cantois, who was one of the coolest guys I ever met, because he was a pilot and he was ambidextrous. He could write with both hands, so he was a terrible instructor because he could take 10 times more notes than anybody else. But anyways, he was at Combat Pike firing the weapon, and he essentially ended up going through the whole process. And then what happened is this squib fired and it fired it down. So it started falling, but this one was a fraction of a second slower.
Oh, so it fired downwards?
So what happened is the missile or the rocket came off, punched off like this, and it was just long enough to pull the ignition lanyard, which then ignited the engine, but the tail of the rocket was pointing at the airplane.
Ooh.
It burnt the whole bottom of the airplane. It burnt a hole apparently this big. It's an amazing that it didn't ignite the number 4 fuel cell, which is right over top of it.
And yeah, that's aluminized propellant. That burns hot. Oof, that was a close call.
So that's one of the stories. And I don't know. There's probably a few others. The biggest thing is that, that's absolutely common amongst every one of us that actually got to fire the weapon. We never saw it launch. Because as soon as the doors rotate, the 8-ball comes on, it launches, and by the time you're out of the smoke, you can't see a thing.
Yeah, it's already long gone.
Yeah, it's long gone. If I could just say one other thing, I'd just like to do a shout out to all the load crews, because those guys, especially in Bagotville and Chatham, Comox not so much because it's pretty nice weather out there, but Comox but Bagotville and Chatham, the load crews, they work their buns off, and when you're doing a mass load and it's minus 35 on the ramp, it is damn cold, and those poor buggers were out there for hours at a time. So they did a super job. I just want to say a shout out to the loadies and the techs.
And I actually had another question to ask you, if you can recall. What would be like the time between alert and like minimum interception? Like how much time did you actually have, like when the radar systems actually picked up an alert?
Oh man!
And how much response time did you actually have?
Well, in the case of like Bear bombers, Tu-95s, I went on a couple of cold shafts off the east coast of Canada. And we would normally have several hours of heads up because we'd pick them up as they came through the GIUK gap. And they have a lot of radar stations in there and sensor stations. So we would get, 2 or 3 hours heads up notice to get ready. And then you would get more and more countdowns. It was only if they penetrated the Canadian Air Defense Identification Zone that we would actually launch.
Oh, okay. So there was plenty of time for intercept.
Yeah, generally speaking. Yeah. The only time that we might have an emergency situation is when we're already forward deployed in a high intensity situation where there's already tensions between us and the Russians or whomever, and because this was aimed at the Russians.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your insight. That's all we have for you today. Come back next time for another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on Our Own Devices, where we'll look at another fascinating artifact, maybe not as destructive as this one. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.